Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited about this webinar. I was talking to Ed before we started, and we had almost 1,000 people register for today's webinar, which is absolutely incredible. And I think that that really goes to show that even though emotional intelligence to some degree could be seen as an evergreen skill, that it's also actually an incredibly crucial skill for responding to our current times. So thank you for your interest. Thank you for wanting to be a more emotionally intelligent leader. And thank you for choosing us as your partner to develop that skill. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. The vision of the Brown School of Professional Studies is to empower you, the professional learners, with the resources, networks, and skills that you need to transform the way the world works for good. And we know research proves that the way the world works currently is not working for the majority of us. Every year, Gallup does an employee engagement survey, and this survey came out in 2024. So I would imagine that this is actually, if they were to do the survey again, I would imagine we'd see an even starker result. But even in 2024, they surveyed the American workforce and asked how engaged they are at work, and over 70% reported being not engaged at work. And that has huge ramifications on our productivity and effectiveness, but also our emotional and mental health. Like, for most of us, we spend the majority of our waking hours at work, and we don't like being disengaged for that long. It doesn't actually feel good. And so we are really excited that we can be your lifelong partners to developing the in-demand skills that you need to change that tide, because that same survey actually also found that managers have a disproportionate impact on the level of engagement and happiness of their employees. So by being here today and by choosing us as a partner, you are stepping up to the plate and you are going to make a difference towards transforming the way the world works for good. And this is not the only way that we can partner with you. If after this webinar, you are as excited as we are about these topics and you'd like to continue to learn with us, we have over 33 professional and early career master's programs, 2 of which I'm going to highlight in just a moment, that we offer in different topic areas and different delivery formats, ranging from fully online to hybrid to in-person. We can also customize a program for you, your team, your organization, or your department. So if you know that everyone on your team could really benefit from learning a skill like this, we're happy to come to you or bring you to campus. And then in addition, we have a portfolio of over 30 non-credit courses, including one that I'm going to highlight in just a moment, and one that you're going to help me build at the end of this program. We love to get your survey results on what you're looking for in our future programs. So the 3 programs I want to highlight as ways that you can continue your learning journey with us based off of your interest in emotional intelligence. The first is our Masters of Healthcare Leadership program. It is a 12-month master's degree designed for professionals across the healthcare industry. It's hybrid. There's 3 one-week in-person sessions at Brown, and the remainder of the coursework is online. And our graduates have reported impressive outcomes. 60% were promoted to VP or C-suite positions, 67% reported a significant salary increase, and 73% received a managerial level position. And you can see a little bit more about what the curriculum looks like on this slide, and we'll send all these slides out later as well. And we're recording it, and we'll send the recording to you as well. Our second master's degree that I'd like to highlight is our Master's in Technology Leadership program. This program is also a 12-month hybrid program with 2 4-day in-person sessions at Brown and the remainder being online. Students come from a wide variety of sectors, including insurance, defense, consulting, sales, government, and healthcare. Students work at a variety of companies, including Google, Dell, and Amazon. And they also have really impressive outcomes. 84% were promoted within 1 year of graduation, 48% were promoted while still in the program, and 24% were promoted to VP or C-suite positions. And then lastly, on the non-credit side, I'd like to highlight our Leader as Coach program. Our Leaders Coach program is one of my favorites. I got to take the program and I use what I learned every single day. It's a program that can be taken either fully online, and if you take it online, it's a 6-week program. You meet one time per week, or you can take it as an intensive 3-day in-person experience, and you cover this same curriculum either way. Throughout the program, you learn a more engaging and productive style of leadership through a coaching-like leadership approach, where you actually get the best out of your direct reports and keep accountability where it belongs by asking powerful questions and structuring conversations as a coach would, as opposed to taking on all the work yourself or being overly directive. It's really been transformational in my life, and we'd love to have you be a part of the program. It starts online September 16th or in person in October, and we'd love to have you there. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce and hand things over to Ed to talk about lessons in leadership, emotional intelligence. He and I were reflecting before this started on the incredible interest in this topic, because in some ways we think of emotional intelligence as this evergreen topic, not necessarily a hot button issue. But I think both of us were really considering that we're at a time where maybe emotional intelligence matters more than ever. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of anxiety about the future of work. We're seeing companies ask for people to come back in the office, for example, and we're also seeing a lot of jobs get cut because of federal regulations and also a lot of just uncertainty about the future. And in addition, we're seeing a lot of introduction of AI, which could replace, jobs that are held by humans or could transform or alter those jobs. And there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about that as well. And emotional intelligence has been proven to be an effective way to collaborate, to be innovative, to work through change, and to keep everyone on the same page. So it makes a lot of sense, actually, that so many of you were so interested in this topic, and I'm really excited that we get to talk about it today. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout. So if you have a question at any point, don't wait till the end to ask it, because I expect to get a lot of questions. So we're going to try to combine as many to get to as many as possible. So click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on Q&A, and type and ask your question there. If you have a comment you would like to share with the full group, you can use the chat function, also in the bottom bar of Zoom, and chat. Right. And then with that, I would love to hand things over to Ed Barrows. He is our professor of the practice in leadership and one of my favorite people to learn from. I feel very privileged that I get to learn from you. He has worked with leaders at all levels in the areas of strategy, strategic leadership, and leader development for the past 25 years. He's an International Coaching Federation certified coach and a member of Harvard's Institute of Coaching. Prior to joining Brown, Ed worked as a managing director at Duke Corporate Education, where he was responsible for designing and delivering programs for a portfolio of global clients. And before Duke, he worked at a variety of professional services positions with Deloitte, General Electric, PwC, and the Palladium Group, where he was vice president and leader of the executive education organization. He has taught everywhere at Harvard University, Boston College, and Babson College. He's the co-author of 2 books, including the 12 Skills Guide, which I love. I have a printout of the wheel of the 12 skills attached to my computer.
No, she does. Yeah, it's true.
And prior to starting his private career, he served on active and reserve duty in the Marine Corps. Right. Welcome, Ed.
Wow. Thanks, Allison. You could have taught this thing. So, hey, it's great to see everybody, wherever you're calling in from, morning, afternoon, evening. Let's jump right into the topic. I thought when Allison was taught, I asked her, I said, how many people are signed up? I thought she said 90. And I said, well, that's about right. Then she said 900. I was a little surprised. So we got, I think, 260 on. So let's jump into the topic of emotional intelligence. Not really new, but apparently it's important. So we want to talk about real quickly relationships. We'll define and give you a little bit of history on EI, but really the crux of what I want to spend the next 50 minutes or so doing is delving into EI from the is what we call it, from the standpoint of you. What can you get out of this? How do you become, let's say, more emotionally intelligent? Because it is something that you can actually get better at. The downside is you have to work at it. So let's spend some time thinking about this. So the reality is, in the workplace, relationships matter. The question is why? Well, Linda Hill from Harvard Business School has done some work on this. And if you think about professionally, especially if you're a manager, but really if you're an individual contributor as well, what's important is we have relationships because we have to get things done at work, not unsurprisingly. So there's people that we work with that we need their cooperation, right? We need them to do things. If they're colleagues or if they work for us or with us, we need them to help out with things. Sometimes we need people to do things because they have to do those things. So there's a level of compliance we need. We may even have people that disagree with us. They may not want to do the things that we want to do or we're asking to do. And then there's times that we'll need people that we'll have to cooperate with. All these things professionally require us to have good relationships. So the backdrop for all this is really managing relationships at work. Now, leadership I've defined, and we're working on some thoughts to add to this at Brown. It's really helping people, a group of people, accomplish a common goal. It's a very straightforward definition, but since we're doing it through people, relationships matter a lot. So it's hard to get things done at work if you have strained or unproductive or even somewhat impaired relationships. Interestingly, it's not just professional relationships that we see matter. And as Allison talked about, research goes back from the pandemic on, and this is some research done by Gallup that says, the likelihood of people to stay in a job or stay in an organization or recommend where they work to colleagues or friends is related to how strongly they feel about having good relationships, in this case, in particular, a best friend at work. And I know in talking with people, they'll say, well, sometimes I don't love my job, but I really love my colleagues or the people that I work with. So the bottom line for us as leaders and managers and even individuals in the workplace is relationships, healthy relationships matter both professionally and personally, since we spend so much time at work. It's gone down over time, ironically enough, since very early days of the Industrial Revolution, but we still spend a huge amount of time at work. Now, what goes into healthy relationships at work? Well, there's some basic principles, and much of this presentation has been pulled together, as you might imagine, from some other research. And I actually did a little bit of research using some AI that I will disclose fully. To give you some insights as to some of the things we're thinking from the literature. But what makes a good set of relationships at work, healthy relationships, some of it has to do with transparency and authenticity. And we teach authentic leadership as the core of our professional development curriculum here. We want people to bring themselves fully to work in a sort of straightforward, authentic, and a way that's honest with respect to who they are. Inspirational, but we want to feel good, and inspiration is an element of that with the people that we work with. We want to feel uplifted at work. Unsurprisingly, emotional intelligence factors into that. Similarly, we want to be mindful of, as Allison's been talking about, there's a lot of stress in the workplace today, and I think in people's lives in general. I won't go into the causes of that, but the reality is the workplace has changed over the last several years since the pandemic, and now the global environment we're operating in addition to our nation, is changing. And that's not uncommon, but I think the degree to which people are feeling that sort of precipitates a better focus and more of a focus on self-care. And then there's what we value as individuals and we bring into the workplace. We don't always, and I would say very rarely, separate ourselves, who we are at work, from who we are outside of work. So emotional intelligence is one of the core principles that goes into making healthy workplace relationships. And it's not new. So when we think about EI and it's sort of the longevity of EI, and one of the things I think about is, and I'll ask you to put some things in the chat if you care to, Allison mentioned that, I'm monitoring the chat, is, what's different for you? I mean, a lot of people are here today, sort of unsurprisingly, but when you think about your workplace relationships, what's different for you about them, say, than your personal relationships? Why are they so important to you? So I'd be very interested to see what people's thoughts are if you want to put those in the chat. And I know other people, and this is typically how I teach my classes, I love to hear what our adult and very experienced students have to say about some of the topics that we're talking about. So let's look at emotional intelligence and sort of what's the history on it. We won't spend too much time on it, but really sort of emerged, and most things in literature emerged from very, very, I would say, early antecedents in the early 1900s into the mid part when we started looking at organizations in earnest around the 1950s. And what we find is around 1990, and then later for Daniel Goleman at Harvard, this concept of emotional intelligence really came out. And you can see on this little graphic that I took from a Harvard Business Review article from 2012 that talked about the most important management ideas of the last, say, century, was we see things like reengineering, the learning organization, systems theory pulled in, balanced scorecard. I worked for those folks, as Allison pointed out, was played in for years. And one of the key elements too is the concepts is Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence. So we know that it's a very popular idea. Now one might say, well, that's Harvard Business School, but it's not just HBS. There's many other examples from social sciences and behavioral psychology that talk about the importance of emotional intelligence. But it's been around probably since the early 1990s. Now, I am not making a case here. I just wanted to pull out some books from an Amazon search of what seemed to be very popular. And again, many of you have probably read some of these books. Daniel Goleman's work features quite prominently in Harvard Business Review and other forums. He's got several books on the topic. Travis Bradbury and Gene Graves have a pretty popular book on it. That one I hadn't seen before on the end, the emotional intelligence or EQ at work. So, and as we're seeing here in the chat, we've got all 5 different generations in the work. There's more focus on diversity and inclusion, or the nature of that is changing too. So we have a lot of things to consider in the workplace, and the relationships that we have are the things that essentially kind of grease the wheels of our productivity. Now, some of you may have seen this video clip before, and I think the question I want you to think about is, have you ever seen anyone that doesn't really seem to have the kind of emotional intelligence in the workplace that they need? So let me just show you an example of what it might look like if someone has, say, lower emotional intelligence.
Okay. What you do at Initech is you take the specifications from the customers and you bring them down to the software engineers. Yes, that's right. Well, then I just have to ask, why couldn't the customers just take them directly to the software people, huh? Well, I'll tell you why. Because engineers
Oops, sorry.
are not good at dealing with customers. So you physically take the specs from the customer? Well, no, my secretary does that, or the fax. So then you must physically bring them to the software people. Well, no. Yeah, I mean, sometimes. What would you say you do here? Well, look, I already told you. I deal with the goddamn customers so the engineers don't have to. I have people skills. I am good at dealing with people. Can't you understand it? What the hell is wrong with you people?
So a lot of it does boil down to what we would call people skills, right? And I think if we really are honest with it and we think about our careers, probably at some point we run across someone that may not have the kind of quote unquote people skills that we need to have at work. So just looking through the chat, people are talking about, and I appreciate everyone weighing in here. So some of the things that we're facing at work, the importance of workplace relationships, the importance of our careers. We don't want to be someone that's branded as difficult to get along with or ornery in the office or whatever the case is. We don't want to be known as that person personally either. Now, in the spirit of AI, there's a tool that some of us researchers use called Undermine, which enables literature review. So I did a literature review in advance of this using this query. Now so you can run the query yourself if you care to, and you can actually look at the papers. I did not do a goodness test of the papers, but I did do a summary of them. And the question was really around what's the impact of any of the dimensions of lower emotional intelligence on people or individuals in the workplace. And you can look at that at a lot of different levels. You can look at the dyadic relationship between a leader and subordinate. You can look at group behavior, et cetera. But the question yielded these results. And I thought it was kind of interesting, and it's not inconsistent with what you found in some of the previous research when we think about it. When we look at the summary findings, what we find is lower emotional intelligence, especially any deficits in what we're going to talk about, self-regulation, social awareness, self-management, really it impacts the workplace and our colleagues as follows. It can lead to, again, not in all cases, what are called counterproductive workplace behaviors. Absenteeism, gossiping, things along these lines. There's quite a few of those. It can lead to more conflict or poorly handled conflict in the workplace. Higher levels of stress and exhaustion. That's why our mindfulness programs have been seeing an uptick over, I would say, the last 12 to 24 months, is because people feel more stressed out at work and are trying to come up with means and ways to manage that more effectively. Poor job satisfaction, dissatisfaction with my boss or the situation I find myself in. And it can lead to a higher level of intention to leave organizations. What I found personally is sometimes people say, I'm going to leave this company, I'm going to leave this company. They don't always do that. And there's important factors that impact that as well, a lot of them being economic. Here's some more of the detailed information that came out of the search that I did. What are these counterproductive workplace behaviors look like? Again, it's an inability to be able to manage oneself effectively as well as manage conflict. And conflict happens at work. The question is always, conflict is not always negative. It can be if it has to do with it's personally oriented, or there's no conflict. A good, healthy conflict around topics and disagreements around perspectives can be useful if it's managed well. So again, the idea of how do we manage conflict productively at work features into having a higher level of emotional intelligence, as does one's ability to get their work done, regulate oneself in terms of procrastination or not. Stress and burnout, again, what we see is the negative emotional side that goes along with this, not wanting to go into work. That's what leads to things like absenteeism and tardiness, high turnover intention, and then lack of citizenship behavior. We just maybe don't act or see people act as if they're good corporate citizens, good stewards of the team that I'm responsible for, someone that's happy to work with my colleagues, that's willing to advance the interests of our organization. Now, what is emotional intelligence? We ought to define this up front. I wanted to give you a little sense of what makes it important. But the idea here is quite simple. Emotional intelligence is really the ability to understand and manage your emotions at work, as well as read other people's emotions and interact with them effectively as well. Now, sometimes we call this EQ. That's probably more of a recent term. It's sort of this combination of your IQ, EQ, and there's other quotients that have been factored in as well as we sort of advance research in the area. But there are some studies that show your emotional intelligence and your ability to read, especially understand and regulate your own emotions and monitor and manage those of other people, is a strong predictor of performance. But the idea is that we need to be more conscious and cognizant of how we are interacting with people in the workplace. Again, going back to the idea that relationships really matter. Now, people with higher emotional intelligence are usually able to stay calm in certain situations, resolve conflict effectively, and respond with empathy, which we'll talk more about. Now, Allison mentioned, I'll throw a few personal anecdotes in. When I was in the military, especially when I was training to become a Marine officer, the part of the logic behind the military in general, and not just the military, other, I would say, high stress types of careers, whether they're pilots, emergency responders, are the training tends to put people in these kinds of situations where they're exposed to stress to see how people react under stressful situations so that they'll be able to perform and manage effectively when those situations really occur. So there are situations where, whether we find themselves by the nature of our work intentionally, such as a job that deals with a lot of stress, like in a hospital perhaps, or emergency room, or not, we want to get a sense for how well we handle various situations that can induce stress. And the idea is emotional intelligence, and our emotional intelligence will give us an understanding of how to do that. Now, this model I took from Harvard Business School online, and I think it's quite useful. There's other models that are similar where they call out empathy and different forms of regulation. But this one does a nice job, I thought, of integrating this perspective of self and others, as well as awareness and action. So we'll start with that as an anchor, and then we'll go through each of these in turn. We will always start with this notion of you and me, the self. What's my level of self-awareness? How well am I able to manage myself? And then we're going to transition to others, and we'll talk about this idea of how well you are able to interpret and understand other people's behaviors and other people's, I'll say, cues, and then manage relationships effectively. So this model does a nice job of pulling together these various components of emotional intelligence in a way that helps us really not only disaggregate them and define them individually, but put them together in a way that enables us to manage more effectively. So let's start with what we would call the self. Now, I'm asking you to do this. Some of you probably can't do this right now, but I would love for you to think about doing this today. I took a bio break and looked at myself before I came in here, and I noticed my hair was messed up. I need to try to fix that. When we look in the mirror, and this is an actual ask of you, most of us look at how we're dressed, our appearance. But if you stare into a mirror long enough, you'll start encountering, I'll say, some of the thoughts that are in your mind. Usually, initially, they're around work and things that are pressing. But the idea here is we want to try to get a little bit deeper with ourselves and start to understand some of the conversation that's happening in our own head in terms of how we're feeling, what we're experiencing. Are we stressed out? Do I feel tired? Am I frustrated? Am I excited that I'll be doing something today? Or I'm hopeful that I'll be working on a new or interesting project? All of these things are associated, that we're going to talk about, are associated and start with one's ability to understand themselves. So if you take nothing away from this discussion today, the starting point for improving your emotional intelligence really is you and understanding, I'll say, what you're experiencing. If you have a tendency to skip over those things, that's going to be a challenge for you to start to increase and improve some of your own behaviors. So let's start with self-awareness and think for a minute about what it is and really kind of what it means, and more importantly, to the promise of the webinar, like how we can make some improvements with that very simply. So self-awareness is, again, it's really understanding your own emotions, interpreting your own feelings, and doing that in the context of understanding what your own strengths and weaknesses are. And I'll talk about some of the things I experience, and I'd encourage you, more importantly, to think about some of the things you experience at work. Now, central to, again, understanding and improving your emotional intelligence is a good grasp of who you are and what you're good at, what makes you feel a certain way in a certain situation, maybe what you're not so good at, especially emotionally. Now, the research suggests that most people think they are highly self-aware. I think the data is around 90 to 95% of people, when you ask them, you say, well, are you so? I'm very, very self. The reality is it's much, much lower than that. It's in the 10 to 15% range. It's kind of like when you ask someone if they're a good driver. I'm a great driver. That couldn't be the case. Not everybody is a good driver, right? Some people are actually very bad drivers, but most people don't go around saying, you know what, I thought about it. I'm a really terrible driver now that I come to think of it. I would say when it comes to self-awareness, we feel the same way, right? We don't want to disparage ourselves. More importantly than saying good or bad, which cannot be super helpful, is to understand what are the things that we experience when. What are the situations that we find ourselves in? So the whole point, back to the mirror exercise, is raising our level of consciousness about what we experience in certain situations. So let me ask you, how are you feeling right now? You don't need to put this in the chat. So like, I'm really angry. No, don't do that. But what I'm asking you to do is think about, how are you feeling right now? Like, what are you experiencing? Are you a little distracted? Yeah, this webinar is not as good as I thought it was going to be. Or I'm driving, so I'm trying to pay attention to the road, but I'm really hungry. What are the feelings that you're experiencing? And as importantly, related to that, are the emotions, right? So what's happening? Not just like, I've got to get to another meeting. I have a whole bunch of things on my to-do list. I wish I hadn't gotten that call from school today, those kinds of things. What are the actual emotions that you're experiencing underneath them? One of the things that you can do that can be very, very helpful is practice naming your emotions. When I say, what are you feeling right now? Think about it. Like, I feel frustrated. I feel happy. I feel tired. And then ask yourself, the next order of question is, what's causing me, or why am I feeling this way? What is it that's driving this? I didn't get enough sleep last night. I had to get up really early today. I just got a new project put on my desk. Try to understand the relationship between the feeling or the emotion that you have and what's likely a cause of that. Now, why is that important? Because the first driver is understanding, again, and interpreting what it is you're feeling. Because if you can't understand what emotion you're feeling or you're experiencing, it's going to be hard to determine what are the things that likely cause that and then moderate those in any way. So there's a book out there, and I haven't read it, but I think it's got an interesting title. You have to be careful not to believe everything you think. And some of you probably are chuckling and you know that. Other people are going, I don't actually know what he means. It's very possible you have an experience where you come, I'm sorry, laughing because a funny story. I always tell stories about my wife. This is actually a funny story. It just literally just popped in my head. So don't believe everything you think. because it's very possible that what you're experiencing can be interpreted different ways. Hopefully my wife's not on this call, but she was outside of our condominium this past weekend, and she ran into a neighbor, and she said, I was talking to a neighbor, and then our other neighbor came up, and she didn't even say hello to me. I couldn't believe it. I was stunned. And I said, I don't know why that happened. She's like, I haven't seen her. One neighbor said, I haven't seen you in a while. The other one just blew it off. So as it turns out, which is it's kind of funny, the neighbor has a twin, and the twin doesn't know her. And she realized this, and she started to laugh. She said, oh, I didn't realize until someone else called her by a different name that it wasn't the person who I thought it was. The point of the story, and honey, if you're on, please, it was intended to be funny, because they think it was, we all tend to do this. Sometimes the things that we experience may not be exactly what we think they are. And asking ourselves, is there another way to think about the feeling that I'm having, or what's potentially causing this, that might get me to think a little bit differently about it? That's the kind of self-awareness that I think we can all improve, but it starts with that firm grounding of, what am I experiencing? What's causing that? And is there another way to potentially think about that? Now, something that can be very useful is looking at this, what's called wheel of emotions, or the circle of feelings. There's different nomenclature for it. And to recognize that fundamentally there are 6 universal emotions that we all start with: anger, fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, and surprise. And you see those at the center of the wheel of emotions on the right-hand panel here. On the second and third order, you can see where other feelings that don't sort of immediately fall into those 6 categories fall. Like when I say, oh, I'm frustrated, really that's a derivative or related to anger. I feel really distant, or I'm kind of suspicious of what's happening. So interestingly, you can identify your feeling, sort of the root or the core primary feeling, by thinking through, what are the range of potential emotions or feelings that I'm experiencing? I feel kind of rejected by this. Well, that's actually related to fear. I might feel fearful that, maybe I don't know this particular topic as well as I should, or maybe I'm not going to be part of this team that's getting set up at work. So the idea is to understand these sort of universal emotions and consider some of the related emotions that comprise them. Now, note, there's a little test coming up later, so please pay attention to these 6 emotions. Now, once you have a better sense of self-awareness, then you can go into, again, we're on that side that has to deal with you and self, is self-management. Now, think of someone, and please, again, don't put it in the chat, like, do you know somebody that struggles with some self-management? What does that look like? Well, maybe they say things like, oh, we shouldn't have said that. Oh, that was kind of inappropriate. Or don't do. I mean, we think about kids sometimes as they're learning, to better manage themselves, and that gets better with age. But vital to your ability to manage and have healthy relationships and interactions is your ability to manage yourself. In meetings, some of you probably know that there might be someone that he or she always seems to talk. And one of the examples I use is one myself, is several years ago, probably 15 or 20 now, I was in a meeting with some colleagues, and I had been at this company for a while. And at the end of a discussion, I had said something, and a guy next to me just turned to me and he said, do you know that you always get the last word in? And I said, what are you talking about? I said, do you know that when you speak, that when someone speaks, you always have to have the last comment? I was totally oblivious to this. This goes back to self-awareness. But once he did that, I'm much more conscious now of the interactions that I have in meetings, as an example. I don't need to always have the last say. It's not important. And obviously, doing that can be off-putting to other people. And the impact can be significant on your team and team members. If you're not able to, I would say, regulate, and that's the actual term for it, regulate your behaviors, such as having to get the last word in or always coming late, for instance. These are just simple illustrations. They have a potential to highly impact the relationship that you have with others in the workplace. Now let's think about this a little bit further. One of the ways to help us improve our own emotional intelligence, and we're in the sort of category of self-management, is to understand situations like the one I just gave you an example of how I show up. What are some of the things that I do well, and what are some of the things I'm not great at? And you could even ask colleagues in a safe way, or someone that like at home, like your partner, spouse, whomever it is, how do I show up in these situations? Are you noticing anything, or am I doing anything that's positive or something that, maybe isn't coming off as so effective. So getting feedback in terms of how we behave at work in the workplace can be helpful. Now, we want to have someone that we trust that will give that to us in a very constructive and helpful way. Now, one of the things you can do, and this is going to sound almost a little bit cliche, but I think people oftentimes overlook these tools and techniques, is familiarize yourself with the tools that can be effective in certain situations. And I'm using stressful situations, or whether it's frustrating situations. Again, pick the emotion that you want to focus on. Things like pausing before responding can be very helpful. Oftentimes, and we know this from the research, that when someone's talking, I'm not really listening, I'm thinking about what I'm going to do to say next. Try to hold back on that feeling. Try to consciously say, I'm not going to say anything right now. Let me pause and pay attention for a little bit longer and really try to interpret what's happening. If you start to feel frustrated, the counting to 10 silently can work. Taking a few deep breaths does work. Again, these are things that we talk about in our mindfulness courses. Getting up and going for a walk, not necessarily a long walk, but, getting some water, or, going downstairs if you work in an office, but whatever it is, to give yourself a little bit of space and time to do what we were talking about in terms of reflecting on how am I showing up. And then in an appropriate situation, if you're frustrated in a productive way, you can use someone else as a sounding board. This comment got made in the meeting, it made me feel frustrated. Does that make sense? Did I interpret it the correct ways, or another way to think about it, to help you kind of, again, balance out and moderate and reflect on the things that are happening and your interpretation of them. But the whole point is we want to give ourselves enough space, time, distance, whatever you want to term it, to manage more effectively at work. But getting some feedback on that, like even from a 360, if you've ever done one of those, can be very helpful. So let's shift to other and talk about social awareness for a minute. So now we're moving to our ability not only to understand emotions in ourselves, but to think about them in the context of others. Now, one of the things that's very interesting, as someone that does a lot of coaching, I oftentimes try to get a sense from the people I work with of what is their interpretation of the situations that are happening. And those are not always accurate, is what I have found. Having someone describe, like, what was happening in that meeting, and that's back to this concept of reading the room. Are you able to, when there's a conversation happening or dynamics taking place, are you able to determine with good effect what's quote unquote really happening, whether it's reading the tea leaves, whatever you want to call it, but understanding what some of the unspoken things that are occurring, what those things are. If you're not sure about that, then that's something that you might want to think about a little more deeply in terms of asking someone, what was going on in this meeting? Did I miss something? Or what was occurring or playing out that wasn't immediately obvious? One of the things that I encourage my students to do is take some time to think about yourself as what I call a researcher at work. So oftentimes when we're in a meeting, we're either participating in the meeting or we're, thinking about something else. What I encourage people to do selectively, don't do it all day or you won't have a job anymore. But what I encourage people to do selectively is imagine you're a researcher and you're studying the people in the meeting. What's happening? Why is she saying that? What is his response like? Who's talking more often than another person? And you can actually go back, you could even use the tool that I showed you earlier under mine, and you can ask questions and try to unpack the nature of the dynamics or the relationships that are playing out in front of you. And you can even write it down and journal about it. It actually can be very, very helpful. You'll get deeper insights, not only to what's happening in your relationship with it, but you'll start to develop and understand some of the patterns that are happening and behaviors that play out more commonly at work. Related to being socially aware is empathetic, and it's a really important predictor of how effective people will be, I would say, over the long term in their career. It's essential. It's an essential component of social awareness, and some models on EI call it out specifically. And it's really about understanding and interpreting and even empathizing, having a sort of shared sense of emotion with those people that we're working with. One of the key things, and people are generally not great at this, is really listening deeply. is trying to clean out of one's own mind the thoughts that you're having and focus exclusively on the other person. You almost have to consciously remind yourself to do that. And in the hustle and bustle of the day, when I'm trying to get this done and get this person out of my office or whatever the case is, I forget sometimes. I think we can all forget that taking the time to really turn my phone over, put my computer screen down, and sit there and listen to that person to understand is really, really important. Now, I've made another note here that the cognitive aspect matters too, and I'll talk more about that. But thinking about how I ought to be interpreting what this person is telling me and their feelings is very important. Before you have a feeling, you have a thought about a feeling, right? So the notion here is I want to try to understand what is this person thinking, what's causing that, this emotion that they're showing me, where is that coming from? It's similar to what we talked about with self-awareness, because they're having a set of experiences that are causing them to behave and act and, I would say, show up in a certain way. So a way to enhance one's own empathy is to think about, as someone is describing something, if you're not necessarily having that shared sense of empathy, ask yourself, did I ever go through a situation that was similar to that? Did I ever lose my job? Did I ever find myself having to stay very late at work at certain periods in time? Did I ever find myself, whatever it is in terms of even the personal relationships I have? Now, the trick to that is you want to be careful as you're empathizing. You're not necessarily just replaying, oh, here's all the things that have happened to me, because that tends to give people a sense that you're not really listening to them. What I'm talking about is using that level of awareness to help truly understand what the other person is experiencing and to have that sort of, to some degree, a shared sense of emotion. And some people are very good about that. They really, you can tell, empathize and almost feel it personally when someone else is describing something. Other people less so. So in the spirit of trying to think about that, I've got a video here I want you to watch. And going back to those 6 emotions, if you're watching here, and if you're driving, please pull over or don't look at this. But the idea here is ask yourself, in these visual cues, what emotions are you seeing? I'm really getting you to think about and test your own ability to understand certain emotions. All right, how did we do? How did people do? I think I saw some interesting things going through the chat. So you really see the range of emotions there. I see some other ones, sort of the second and third order, angerish, right? Nice one there, Diana. Disappointment. There's some shock in there, right? Thanks, Pauline. Surprise featured in there. Someone asked the question, I think, if these are AI generated. To the best of my knowledge, they're not. It's just a video of people demonstrating different emotions. Now, if you're looking at the chat and you're saying, I didn't see some of those things, then that's helpful for you to think about this idea that, maybe I could do myself I could put in a little more effort into thinking about what are some of the emotions that maybe I didn't detect, or what are the things that I can do to maybe pay attention or understand a little differently. So this notion of thinking about my ability to detect what's happening, awareness of others can be helpful. Now, when we think about emotions and moods, we're looking at an effect, right, that we're seeing show up here. And this is really targeted on emotions, but the idea is sometimes we're trying to interpret people's moods. So emotions are generally specific event driven. They're brief in duration. You saw surprise, you see someone crying, depending on the severity of the situation, it may last for a long time or a short period of time. And you saw in a little over 3 minutes, a real range of emotions. I see some of these, Ferris, thanks. You really have to pay attention. I think Ferris's point is really good. Well, you have to pay attention and to really understand what people are experiencing. And oftentimes at work, yeah, okay, whatever. I mean, we're so busy, we don't often take the time to do that. And the point here is they're accompanied by specific facial expressions. That's why we did the activity. So moods are different, though. They're longer term in nature. They sort of tend to be persistent. They're not caused by an immediate event. And they might be a little harder to detect, but that's also important for us to try to check in with people as at work or as a leader to say, hey, I kind of noticed the last couple of days, you seem to be, I don't know, just I want to make sure I'm getting this right, a little bit in a low mood. I try not to use down because people don't like that too much, but how are you feeling? I think that's the kind of stuff that we can easily do as leaders without being too disruptive. But important and relevant to understanding the emotions and having awareness of what's happening with other people is how we manage our relationships with people in general. We want to have, as we talked about at the outset, positive relationships, right? We want to have relationships that are both professionally and personally productive, because that contributes not just to work getting done, but our overall well-being. And one of the things that's really central to that, again, is listening as a fundamental skill. So what we separated here in the activity is paying attention visually to people, but we won't necessarily do that in isolation. People are talking oftentimes at the same time we're experiencing their facial expressions. But linking those two things together for that really deep listening is an important skill in building effective relationships and managing relationships. Most of us really want to be heard and understood. If you really think about it, if you've ever watched a customer service interaction where someone's saying something, the other person's not paying attention, the customer didn't get something, he's getting madder, and the customer service representative doesn't. I'm using that as this very simple example. You recognize there's a disconnect here. But if you've ever had the experience of when you've been frustrated and someone is really listening, or you've been happy and they're really empathizing, that tends to make us feel like, wow, that person understands us. And that gives us the sense that, wow, they care about us, and that's important to relationships. Now, another thing that's important, and goes back to authenticity, is this notion of trust and building trust-based relationships at work, really anywhere. Trust, we use something from Charles Green, sorry about that, called the trust equation. And what the trust equation does is it puts trust in a formula. Then trust then, or really trustworthiness, if you will, is a function of 4 variables. There's 3 in the numerator and 1 in the denominator, and you can find this online. So the ability to build trusting relationships, it's preceded by being a good listener and understanding, but it's about being credible in what we do at work and what we say. It's about being reliable in following through the things that we say we're going to follow through, and intimate insofar as we have good relationships that are appropriate with people. They're more than just, say, topical or perfunctory in nature. We actually, I know something about you. I was asking, and it's divided by one's self-orientation. So when I'm talking with you, And I've seen this happen at work. Like someone says something and then a person continually responds with, let me tell you about myself. I had someone ask me recently, I was delivering a session, and they said, you know, Ed, I don't know much about you. Where are you from? Tell me about yourself. And I said, well, I'm from Boston. And as soon as I said that, the person said, oh, my best friend is from Boston. And then for another 10 minutes, they talked about their best friend. I got a sense that they weren't really interested in understanding about me. And I think we all interpret those things if we're not mindful of how we're showing up and the nature of the relationship that we're creating, we can inadvertently default to just kind of talking about myself. And there's quite a bit of power in the curious question, trying to understand and manage effectively what other people are experiencing. You know, another way to build relationships at work, people are generally busy, they have a lot going on. You know, ask how you can help them out. Is there something I can do in a situation that would enable you to be more effective, or maybe take something off your plate? Again, a simple example from one of my recent coaching sessions with someone. I asked someone who had, I think, about 12 or 15 people working for them. I said, how well do you know whether or not they have a partner? He said, well, some of those people I know that they have a partner. I said, okay. I said, do you happen to know maybe when their birthdays are, or do you know anything about their kids or their pets? People very concerned about their pets. And the person said, which I wasn't surprised at all, because I think most of us fall into this category. He said, well, some of those things I know. And I said, well, people are going to want to know, as you know, this person was a supervisor, that you care about them. So it's probably important to know what's going on with their personal life in a safe, healthy, boundary mindful way. You know, what are the things that are happening in your life? And because people tend to bring those things into the workplace and they just want to know other people care. So investing time into those relationships, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it tends to pay real rich dividends. If you're the kind of person that goes into work, heads down, to-do list out, and you're cranking through stuff in the day, that's great in terms of productivity. I don't think any supervisor would ever say, don't do that. I do wonder if you might be more effective in building relationships if you, myself, anyone, took a little bit of time to actually really start to explore a little bit more about people, say over lunch or coffee or whatnot. So when we think about putting this all together, this idea of how does it fit? I like this model of sort of cascading emotional intelligence. And really the behaviors and the attributes on the left-hand side drive what's on the right-hand side. It starts with conscientiousness. You know, coming here today was great for you, but going away from this webinar and asking and thinking about how will I be more conscientious about reading people's emotions, listening and understanding and empathizing with what's happening at work. That's being conscientious improves our ability to perceive not only our own emotions, but those of others as well. So it starts with a willingness and a desire and an ability to consistently do it. And then back to cognitive ability. Am I interpreting what I'm experiencing correctly? Am I interpreting what other people seem to be or are telling me what they're experiencing correctly, whether it's individually or in a group? And then am I able to demonstrate and have emotional stability? When things are frustrating and I'm feeling frustrated, or things are really, am I able to kind of pause and take a step back, give myself some space and manage things effectively with whether a dyadic relationship that I have with other people or in a group setting? So it's conscientiousness, thinking or having the ability to understand and interpret what people are experiencing, what they mean, and then regulating ourselves can be very, very useful in terms of emotional intelligence. So the last thing I'll leave you with, I do have a summary slide, but if you haven't seen this before, you can go online to Truity and you can actually take a test. Those are my results. You can see I have to work on empathy there. But there's a typology in there. You can put, I don't sell this. I'm not related to this company. There's nothing to do with Brown. I think it can be handy. You can put your email in there. And if you've taken this, you might find it useful. And there's other tools as well out there. So I'm not claiming this is the only one, but this one you can do free. And it's actually kind of handy. It gives you it's a standard report, but it gives you an insight of where you fall in these dimensions: awareness, other awareness, emotional regulation or control. Empathy is broken out. And well-being, interestingly, people tend to fall down very lower than they typically might think they do in this area of emotional or just overall well-being. Again, that's sort of in this mindfulness category. So why does all this matter? Let me just wrap up here and then I'll turn it over some questions. It's normal to have feelings, but if you're self-aware and you can regulate those, I feel frustrated right now. It causes me to worry or sometimes take that out in certain ways, but I'm gonna deal with it differently. That can be helpful. Empathy really factors into having effective relationships at work. All of it sort of wraps into this conscientiousness. But if you really focus on trying to make some incremental improvements in your own self-awareness, others' awareness, and ability to regulate, you will be more effective as a leader and as a colleague at work. So Allison, let me throw it over to you. I think we've had a lot of things coming through. Any specific questions?
Yeah, we have some great questions in the Q&A. So thank you everyone for submitting your questions. I actually want to start with a question of my own to all of you via a poll. And after I launch the poll, I'll keep the poll open and we will start answering your questions because I know we're short on time. The purpose of this poll is that we take your feedback very seriously in terms of what we build next. So what courses, what programs we build next. And so the first question is asking you to choose your top 3 skills that you'd like to learn from us. And the second question is asking, how likely would you be to enroll in a program if Ed were to teach a 6-week course on all the leadership skills, emotional intelligence being just one? How likely would you be to enroll in that class? So I'm going to keep that poll open. Thank you for taking the poll. It makes a big difference to us. And we're going to turn over to your incredible question. So one theme of a question that's coming up quite a bit, Ed, is about the intersection between emotional intelligence and identity. So how do I, interpret the emotions of people from cultures I don't share? And is emotional intelligence always perceived well based off of identity? Like, do women have a harder time expressing it? Do people of color come across differently? Like, what is the relationship between emotional intelligence and identity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's research from what's called the Globe study and Greta Hofstadter's work previous to that with IBM that we know there are important cultural differences that people have personally, individually, and in the workplace. So without knowing the literature specifically, I would imagine that people, both from a cultural dimension and also a personal dimension, are more or less comfortable with sharing certain things at work. I'm not exactly sure about gender. I want to be careful of that because I'm not always sure that gender gives us the insights that we would necessarily think that it does. So I'll stop there, but what I will say is people are different when it comes to the amount of emotional intelligence they have or what they want to share. I think when it comes to the workplace, being curious can be really important in a respectful way, but also, asking people if you're asking something about them that seems personal, giving them an opportunity to say that maybe they don't want to share something, or that's, that it just understanding more about certain people want to share things to a greater degree than other people do, and just being more comfortable with that. So we just always have to be mindful of overstepping boundaries when it comes to the nature of the relationships that we have.
Thank you. So next question I love and really strongly relate to is when emotions show on your face, how can you regulate your emotions in the moment when people on your team can see your response?
Yeah, that's probably into the medical world that may be beyond what I do. But I think having the awareness that you tend to have significant visual responses is a start. Then asking yourself, well, what causes those? And then trying to, again, it can be useful to have a work ally that tells you how you're showing up, trying to give yourself the awareness that in certain situations, maybe certain things get said that cause that, and pre-preparing for those. This person, Allison always says, that's not fair to say, Allison will sometimes say this. I just want to make sure I ready myself if she says that or he says that or whatever the case is. That isn't to say that we should tolerate any bad behavior. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the awareness of the kinds of responses or the things that occur in the workplace that elicit certain reactions from us, sort of preparing ourselves in advance can be quite helpful.
I think that's a great answer. And I would add on to that just from experience, because
Please
my
do.
face is also really loud. So I totally understand where this question is coming from. So this is not based off of research, it's just based off of my own experiences. I'll also just acknowledge it sometimes. Like I'll also just say, I'm aware that my face just said X. As like I did have that reaction. However, I'd like to talk about why. And I found that to be pretty effective, that people know that you can't always control your initial nonverbals. And so just by kind of like naming the elephant in the room, people are ready to kind of move on. So that's the other thing I would add from experience, not research, not expertise like Ed, but definitely.
No, but what I like about what Allison said, I think is useful, is she actually touched on the concept, this authenticity and transparency. I think Allison's there's not a lot about Allison that I think she's hiding in work. I think she's just very plain talking. And I think that's a bigger question around culture change, et cetera. But I think where you have open relationships and you understand how people react in certain situations, they tend, any sort of response that might seem out of the ordinary really, after a little while, doesn't seem so out of the ordinary at all.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll answer just one more question. Unfortunately, we are at time, but I really like this question, which is, what advice would you have for people who either are neurodivergent or work with people who are neurodivergent in terms
Absolutely.
of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, as someone who is neurodivergent, I can help with this question. I think the most important thing for neurodivergence is awareness and understanding that, again, if you're neurodivergent, how does that manifest itself in the workplace? Letting other people know that there might be instances where you do that can be helpful, and giving people a little space, and I'll dare say the word grace if they are neurodivergent, and again, trying to be a little more patient and accepting of that. We all don't experience the world the same way, and giving someone the latitude and the understanding and kind of the appreciation that this person tends to react a little bit differently to things. I think just, again, it goes back to that transparency, integrity, honesty, and willingness to kind of open oneself up and appreciate differences that people have, which can be hard at work.
I really can. Thank you so much, Ed. This was incredible. I learned something from you every time, and the chat is, there are many people saying in the chat that they learned a lot as well.
Good.
So thank you so much for this incredible
Thank you.
presentation. And thank you everyone who came today and participated in our poll. It's really helpful to us. I also saw one message in the chat, which is a great point. Thank you for bringing this up, is that we do have a whole portfolio of mindfulness-based programs as well. And that might be something that you may be interested in terms of self-regulation, self-awareness, and
Right.
also just because right now is a stressful time. So we'd also really love to invite you to look into our mindfulness programming as well. And we'll send a link to this afterwards in our follow-up email. So thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you, Ed, for this incredible presentation. And we hope to see you. Our next free masterclass is on May 15th. It's with Baba Prasad, who is another professor of the practice of leadership at SPS. He's incredible. And he'll be teaching a framework for strategic agility for responding in uncertain times, which I think we couldn't ask for a better, more timely topic. So I hope to see you there and also in one of our classrooms very soon. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Everybody.